Dobre jutro. I will continue in English, so I will leave it as a mystery how much Serbian I speak. Thank you, Professor Veskovic, for the introductory remarks. When I was asked by Milan to give a speech here, and he, in a quick email, asked me to speak about open source as a business model. About outsourcing. He meant open source. And I wrote back spontaneously, outsourcing is a thing of the past. Outsourcing is a thing of the past. Maybe we should rather talk about from outsourcing to crowdsourcing, and from cooperation to collaboration in an open environment. We all have heard about open innovation, open source on a coding level. He seemed to have liked the text, and very quickly it was in the program. And I've been reflecting, okay, maybe is that really the right focus to address mainly software companies from Novi Sad, from Vojvodina. And so we put a lot of reflection into looking into from crowdsourcing to my open source experience. We put here the agenda. I will make a few introductory remarks so you understand where I'm coming from. I do have an academic degree, but I don't consider myself in a sense an academic. So I never could rival Professor Veskovic on academic views and outlooks from a, let's say, theoretical level. I'm a practitioner, and I'm focusing on business development services in the ICT sector for, I can claim, almost 30 years. I don't know who remembers still a company called Nixdorf Computers. It was a German, very successful company. And I started in 1984 in a venture capital company that was founded by one of the co-founders. And I know this because I recently found a picture in an old magazine that was called Computer Magazine. And then they added "and software" on top of the title. So, so much for software and technology. It used to be only hardware. Software had no relevance. Let me briefly give you an overview of what I tried to and what is the thought behind. I will briefly address impact of technology. It could say impact of ICT technology. I left it technology because I will come to that deeper. Today there is no technology that is not impacted by software, by digital coding. I will briefly talk about terminology, which is also something that's developing, disappearing. Outsourcing should not be used any longer. It's not really a term that is applicable in today's advanced economies or the way of cooperation, but I will come to that. From open source to open change. Open source is the coding level, open change is the management level. One only works with the other. I will briefly address that. Innovation driven by software. In most advanced industries, it's software that drives the innovation. Best example is automotive. Impacts for the software industry, some consequences, conclusions. So I have, according to the schedule here, 15 minutes left. I'm the son of two theologians in the Protestant church. As a young child, I learned a good preaching never lasts more than 20 minutes. And I could observe that this is true because after 20 minutes, half of the old men had fallen asleep. So when I see the first ones falling asleep, I will come to the end. Who still remembers punching cards from his studies? Yeah, I do. We choose that picture as an introduction. When you look at what had happened in the IT sector, in the software sector, including in the way software was developed, it was a very insular business. And today, there is no piece of software really that makes sense unless it can be connected with existing software infrastructure which again can be deducted to the way you have to cooperate, because if you want to connect it to somebody else's software, you better speak with that person or these teams before you develop your software, whether it makes sense the way you do it. Let me briefly give you some remarks on my own background. In this offshoring, outsourcing, nearshoring is a funny term because it's often used for cooperation between regions and countries, even with no lakes or oceans in between. So it's for me also a no term to talk about nearshoring to Serbia. I think I can drive by car here, I don't need a boat. So, I started in the 90s to work with Indian software companies, doing a lot of studies, a lot of academic work in those days, analyzing what was the success factor. This was prior internet, when you had to use satellite, etc. I have worked with European Union projects in the Caribbean. We looked into Africa, what's happening in the ICT world. And so it's a fairly broad experience over 20 years. What are success factors? How are things evolving? How are companies evolving in even the most remote places? And so I started 3 years ago. I worked on a project with USAID and Booz Allen Hamilton for the Serbian software industry. And I'm also on the board of an association that used to be called Linux User Group that was started 10 years ago with the help of IBM. IBM is very strong in the open source area, surprising for many who never looked into open source. Today it's called the Open Source Business Alliance. We just merged with another German organization, and I think we are among the largest in Europe. And the focus is on open source, but interoperability. We are close to Microsoft. Microsoft is very interested in what this association is doing. I'm a member of the board. We had several events already with the Stuttgart area. LISOC was started in Stuttgart. The Serbian delegation has been at a trade show there. So first links have been established with member companies. The association, I will briefly come. Okay, so much for the introductory remarks. Impact of technology. Now this is a slide I prepared in 1996, 1997 for a presentation. We had discussions on the impact of the internet and in New York. It was done with a management association which had their annual meeting in Prague at the time. And I made the comment, well, mainly what the internet means is how to put 6 billion brains to work. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, ultimately the internet will allow, if there are 20 people in the world who collect one rare butterfly. In the pre-internet time, it was hard for them to find out who else would collect that butterfly. In the internet time, it's a matter of days, because everybody knows that whoever knows to read and to write and collects butterflies, he will use the internet to find likes. The same is true for software, will come for software development, for collaboration, for sharing. Now this, when you look at technology drives globalization, it was on globalization issues, globalization drives technologies. Economics and politics are bystanders. They can help to facilitate, but they cannot, and they never will, be key in the technological development as such. That's happening somewhere in the world. It happens in some places faster, depending on the environment, in others slower. Today, the transparency is as never before available to everybody who has access to the internet. But it's the technology or the ICT, again, we should stick to ICT. When I talk about technology, I mean information and communication technology as such, and behind it, as we know, it's software. Now, what is very important, talking about time, space, change of perception. The older ones among us, if you go back 20, 30 years, and you try to remember what was the global consciousness of our generation at the time, there was no global consciousness as it exists today in the younger generation. Still, you need to know there's a global consciousness. You need to understand with whom are you cooperating, what are the expectations, what technology is being used. But it's also important to understand that the change is still rather accelerating. technologies that the changes are not happening within decades. When we looked at, I come to this, we realized it's really within 5-year terms or less that new concepts evolve and are thrown overboard because new ones come. These are the management techniques, depend also on technology. When you look at hierarchies, what are hierarchies in companies? What were they for? They were only there to collect information, consolidate information, pass it to the next level, and ultimately take decisions. Today, you can collect, if you're smart enough, you can collect information on any subject that you understand rapidly. You go to Wikipedia, you rapidly understand even a fairly unknown context with focused reading. All this, just keep in mind, never existed. Why do I stress this? For you as software companies, you face theoretically competition from thousands of companies in the world. Let's say you want to go to the German market. Before you, at least 1,000 Indian companies have tried exactly to address the same company. So what will a German company do when somebody else knocks at the door? They say, sorry, no interest. I'll come to that later, but it's also important to understand that even the competition arena has changed a lot. Quickly, I will keep that very brief terminology. We all heard about economics, outsourcing as it used to be. In the 90s, when the GSM boom started, a lot of investment was done in the telecommunication arena. Smart Indian software companies, they would simply give 500 to 1,000 programmers to MCI, to AT&T. They would send 2 managers, and they would have even safety. They would control the safety, and they would do the programming. The company, it was basically lending their people to these US companies. It was done on a large scale. Now, why do I put here Wiki? I really recommend you using Wiki, even become active in Wiki if you have a domain of your expertise. Show it, demonstrate it. Let me briefly address the expertise. Everywhere, and the same is true in Serbia, when I come to a new place in the world and I meet software companies who may be successful with products in their specific market. And of course, the next thing one assumes is that maybe I can sell these products, the software, outside the market. I give you one example. 3 years ago, and it was difficult, I met many companies here in Serbia who had ERP systems, which they thought they could sell at the Cebit. Now, how do you tell companies that we don't need your ERP systems? We have too many in Germany already. We have 150 companies in Germany that provide ERP systems. And the only reason anybody will, within Germany, buy any of these companies is if they do have a client base. So a bigger company buys company A, buys company B, throws out the migrates to their own ERP, and the price is only on the market, not on the product. I don't know if anybody's here. There was even a company specializing in Germany to help clients to find the right ERP system by finding somebody who already, if you own a car dealership, a big one, so to find an ERP system that is already used in other car dealerships. Okay, follow the sun concepts was a step in between. Big companies, Daimler, Mercedes, for example, in the 90s, we were close to Mercedes, telecom companies. Mercedes started to have development centers in Palo Alto, Germany, and India. So they started really to work 24 hours around the clock, Saturdays, Sundays maybe they had a break to do maintenance, etc. But it was the first concept of continuous development. Even this, it's okay, global workflow. Economics, it's still worthwhile reading for some food of thought, understanding what's happening. Okay, crowdsourcing. Let me briefly talk about crowdsourcing, as this is ended up in the topic of my address here, of my presentation. Who of you has an idea what crowdsourcing means today theoretically and what it means in reality? Anybody was confronted crowdsourcing actively? If you today, I give you an example. We were looking for a very specific solution for a programmer for a very dedicated part. And Thomas Uhl, who is a technology guru in Germany in open source, I'm working very closely with, he Twittered that through his network. Within 48 hours, he had a reply from an American living in Vietnam saying, okay, you can do that for $50 an hour. And he's doing that now. Yeah? That's on a low-end crowdsourcing. In many industries, when you go to, we talk about, you mentioned broadband across. Yeah, we will have wireless broadband. What does it mean? It means that if you have simple data entry jobs, you can sell these to any housewife. If she has half an hour, she can do it, and she is being paid. So it really will change the whole way we organize companies, we organize hierarchies, including social systems, pension systems, etc. And again, it's technology, and it will happen. And if we don't do it, China, India will do it, and we lose no jobs. So we better innovate also in the way we organize societies, depending on available technologies. Even this you find on Wikipedia very quickly if any term. Now, summary here. Pico jobs are these small jobs that I just referred to, like simple data entry. Okay, let me briefly talk about open source and open management. Who of you is using open source code in its daily work? Okay, already some. Let me tell you that no large software company today that is maintaining, developing software products, including Microsoft, including SAP, SAP as it's sometimes called, will develop its products without heavily relying on existing software, which often is open source. Now, what are the key concerns? Why do the companies do that? What is the core problem today? The problem is time to market. If you this applies also to the techniques being applied. Now, what is the key problem using this open source? It's not the code. It's the legal environment in which you are operating. Because open source, number one, there's I will not go into the different types of licenses. Also, I recommend strongly for all of you to look this up in Wikipedia and read about the different licenses available from Simple GNU. This guy, Stallman, was like the inventor of the first open source license. He's a weird person. He looks weird. He's has a he's an autist. He has it's a certain symptom. Many of these people, he's an autist, yeah, and have extreme other capabilities. I think he's even a mathematician. And you see Linux Torvald, who developed the first Linux. So the open source is only 10 years old. When you look at, let's say, terms of technology, when you look what has happened. So the strong recommendation for all of you, be familiar with open source concepts. When you develop software, keep in mind why reinvent something that is available, but at the same time watch out on the legal impacts of using this. I'll give an example. German Siemens, you all know Siemens. Now Siemens was normally developed everything in-house. They wouldn't use officially any open source, but of course their programmers used it. So they suddenly released a product with software that contained open source with certain licenses, and they had added on top of this open source. And now in a simple way, open source means normally that if you add software to the existing open source, you have to give back to the community what you added as open source. But Siemens wanted to sell this product as their own proprietary software. So they went to court, and the Siemens lawyers, in a, well, almost arrogant way, thought we are right, we are Siemens. They lost the case. They had to publish the software of a product which they didn't like. Today, Siemens has a division within its corporate technology that is a gatekeeper. Whoever uses open source needs to talk to them to get legal advice, how to do it. It's not forbidden. On the contrary, they are encouraged to do it because time to market is critical. I'll give you a last example. We have in, or maybe I'll spare this. Okay, let me give you, because most people think collaboration, sharing knowledge is something very new. Henry Ford was sued by Selden in 1911. It was a so-called patent grabber. It happens in the US every day. Milan develops a piece of technology. So I'm a bad guy. So I claim a patent. I have more money, I have the better lawyer, so I sue him for damages. That happened to Henry Ford. Somebody claimed he was using his invention of a motor. Ford won the case. Now what he did is that this shouldn't happen again in the automotive sector, so he started to build a cooperative for patents. And in the early 1940s, 600 automotive patents were open to be used by the companies who shared this cluster, call it, yeah? So much for cooperation. And it had a big impact on Americans' entrance in the World War II. I don't want to go into war, etc., but when we look at technology, okay, open change management. This is not so much for software companies, but when you try to work with larger organizations in bigger countries, you have to be aware that there are two ways they do business, and they know. I mentioned SAP, Microsoft knows they have to be interoperable, they have to change their business models away from proprietary selling licenses is a last century thing. If today, when we talk about open change management, a company that wants to use open source on the coding level, if it's not open to sharing problems and ideas, it doesn't mean that everything, we never talk about free software. It's all done with the objective to make money. But if you want to develop everything in-house, if you want to solve your problems in-house, you pay a lot of consultants. Today, CIOs of big companies they have to watch not to be blamed by the antitrust office, yeah, when they cooperate, but they start to share problems. The companies are changing. I'll give you an example on the automotive sector, which I mentioned before. It's assumed in the automotive sector that 80%, some people say all innovation, is driven by software today. Why? Because a car today contains so much software that every function is basically replicated, shown in a virtual way by software. So when you reflect how you do that differently, you quickly are back in your virtual world trying to optimize on a logical level. So the automotive sector is right now before a paradigm shift into a more open environment, including open source. Now, they realize they can't do that without changing their management style, being open in this. Why do I address this here to you? If you don't want to be at the end of the food chain, picking up small jobs that are badly paid because somebody needs quickly something to be fixed or developed, if you want to move up the ladder of better paid jobs in any corporation or to win the trust at all, you need to be familiar with the areas the companies are interested in and the management is interested in, because otherwise you never will make it out of you never go beyond talking to some software project managers who look for someone they can buy as cheap as possible some solutions from. I will leave it with this. Okay, let me briefly, because many have, I mentioned the LISOC and Open Source Business Alliance. You also find the background information in the internet. But the focus of this open source commercial open source. It's the largest German association of companies and users of commercial open source applications. Now, commercial open source simply means you don't pay for the application any license fee, but you pay for service, for installation. Now, I have to put this into proper respect. Most companies run so-called dual license models. You give your basic solution for free. If it's good, it is rapidly distributed. And then you sell specific add-ons, you sell licenses, or you only provide this software for an abonnement, like a certain fee. And even when you look at large software companies, they move to this, what is also an old term, software as a service, where you don't talk about license fees anymore, which is very difficult to maintain. I can tell you that the biggest problem a company like Microsoft has today in large companies, that they consider their license model a pain in the neck. Not the software it's running, but to count every PC and to give Microsoft, say exactly how many hundred computers they have installed what on, is really a pain, hundreds of pages of contracts. So that's even a strong motivation to move away from such software. But again, the Open Source Business Alliance is based in the headquarters in Stuttgart, and some Serbian companies already are members. PS-Tech in Belgrade and Exacom from Novi Sad. It's open, and what I recommend to you, the software companies, if you want to move to Finland, we have finished, to Spain, try to build close contacts with the community. You will have a workshop on clusters this afternoon on the clusters, but even as an individual company, if you have a cousin in Berlin, so find out, there is a software association in Berlin, find out when they have a big interesting conference, you will learn something and you make some contracts. If you're lucky, you have the first small business project, and you can slowly penetrate this community for cooperation. Okay, the innovation driven by software. The most advanced area is definitely the automotive sector when it comes to software usage, software technology usage. Second is, it's purely software, is telecommunication. And I want briefly to address the issue of methodologies in software development. Classical, for those, I mean, you software experts will know, you have classical linear development, then you started to have iterative development, and you talk about today about agile methods. Waterfall, prototyping. Okay, I want briefly to stress the importance of the agile methods that you will face more and more, even in with medium-sized software companies who initially, if you try to enter a foreign market, will be your best bet, because it's very difficult to win an end customer unless he has its own in-house software development, like a small software company. Otherwise, you will end up with a larger software company who will outsource to you. I don't want to use the term, who will collaborate with you in the development initially of some small pieces. If you're good, you increase your share. And from there, you may be able to pick up an end client. Now, let's say, okay, let me first give you an example. Telecom gave recently a very up-to-date presentation on their usage of Scrum. Deutsche Telekom developed a so-called media center where you can store films, pictures. It's very new in the market. And normally Telecom talks about development cycles of 1 to 2 years for a new product, which is too slow when they compare this with competition. And they used strictly old linear waterfall software development models. So somebody decided, okay, this infotainment center, which we are doing, if we come to the market in 2 years, it's too late anyway, so we don't need to develop it. So let's try to use Scrum, which they, of course, had trainings before, for this project. And what do you think was the difference to the old way in doing it? 15 months versus how many months? 10, 8, 6, 7, 4. It was 3 to 4 months. Well, it's still a bureaucratic organization. So the bureaucracy of releases and etc. didn't change. One of the project managers said it was like day and night. Now, if you as a Serbian software company, you come into such a market, you face somebody who realizes with Scrum or any of the other. It's not, Scrum is one example, but on purpose I focus on Scrum here. And you never heard about Scrum, and the first thing he will ask you, what have you done? Are you using Scrum? And you say, no. Okay, so he says, you're already out because you cannot cooperate in a methodology he's using. You may know all the rest, but you simply cannot tie into his development team. And he will not even discuss with you anything further. So whenever you have the opportunity to venture into new methodologies, I know you have the chance for almost free training units. Use it, because it's very difficult to pick that up later, and it's key for communication with potential clients. Let me give you what the latest trends are. Who knows the Eclipse project pushed by IBM? Eclipse. Okay, also a few. Also worthwhile to look into as what's going to happen in the market. Eclipse is a foundation strongly supported by IBM, open source, controlled open source, top-down, it's orchestrated. And they are just now starting a new project called Orion. I know that Execom is close to that. It basically means that you can develop the software in the browser. All the tools will be provided in the browser. That means I can go to Starbucks coffee and develop there. Or I can say, okay, I have a guy in a Serbian company. Okay, he knows this, he can do it. Also, Orion, Eclipse. Okay, I'm coming to the end. Now I put here at the end 7 billion brains working together. I have one last slide on this. Okay, this is, I don't know, they put this in. Find your role. You can't play the violin and the contrabass at the same time. So when you go to a customer, don't tell him, I know all the instruments, he will not believe you. Focus. Try to be specific in one area and not too many areas. Okay, this I wanted to, it's not even that new. Top Coder, I also recommend to look it up in the web. It's a company, again, it's a US-based company, very interesting concept. They basically provide a platform to companies who are looking for software solutions, and they will put this solution, they will divide it into small jobs, and it's open to anybody registered in this database. And they do fairly complicated software projects already. This is crowdsourcing, let's say at its best, that exists today. Yeah. Let me close with one example that is, it's academic and very practical. The European Union has a project called OSIEPA, which is whoever's here from any cluster Serbian, it's something you should try to figure out, and whatever follows there to join. MFG with using OSBA is part of it. And they basically, it's a nice travel event, I call it, but what the European Union is trying to bring together open source activities in the public sectors of the member states. It's a very well done project. People look at, in Spain, in the Extremadura, there's a hospital, children's hospital, completely run on open source software. Why? They had no money. So local companies did that. In Manchester, a professor using agile methods developed software with the kids from a ghetto who knew nothing about software, using agile methods to develop software for their own, nothing mission critical, but develop software rapidly. Yeah? so much. I hope I didn't talk about things that were completely not understandable. I don't know if we have time for a few quick questions now, or whether we do that later.
We can do that now. It's not a problem. If somebody has questions now, we can take it. But maybe even later.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.